Women don't belong in war. Get off my field. Brock Reynolds said it loud enough for 500 soldiers to hear. Then he grabbed Ava by the collar in front of referees, in front of senior officers, in front of cameras recording every second, and shoved her backward like she was nothing. The crowd went silent. Ava didn't fall. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, and that look made Brock angrier than anything else could have. He swung his leg back and drove it toward her stomach with everything he had. That was his mistake, because Ava Carter had been waiting for exactly that moment. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay until the end. Because what happens in that ring will change the way you think about strength forever. The morning started the way most mornings at Fort Hardin started, with noise. 500 soldiers moving, shouting, stretching, arguing, laughing. The kind of organized chaos that only a massive military base in Central Texas could produce. The annual Joint Forces Combat Showcase had been running for 11 years. It was the kind of event that made careers. Junior officers came hoping senior officers would notice them. Veterans came to prove they still had it. Instructors came to remind everyone exactly who they were. And Brock Reynolds came to dominate. He always had. 3 consecutive years as top finisher in the hand-to-hand bracket. 2 commendations from his commanding officer. A reputation so thick it practically walked into rooms before he did. He was 6'2", 230 pounds of muscle and ego, and he moved through the base like a man who believed the whole place had been built around him. That morning, as soldiers registered and collected their bracket assignments near the main administration tent, Brock stood surrounded by a small circle of his closest trainees. Younger men who laughed at everything he said, who handed him things before he asked, who had learned that being near Brock Reynolds was either very good for your career or very bad for your health, depending on the day. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and scanning the bracket sheet with the other when his eyes landed on the name, Ava Carter, Navy SEAL, age 24, Arizona. He read it twice. Then he looked up at the men around him. Is this real? Corporal Danny Marsh, 22 years old, and terrified of saying the wrong thing, leaned in to look. Yes, Sergeant, looks real. They put a woman in the tournament. Nobody responded. They put a woman, Brock said again, slower this time, like he was explaining something to children in a combat showcase, on a military base, in front of 500 soldiers. Private First Class Leo Torres, who was smarter than he usually let on around Brock, kept his eyes down. He had learned that when Brock started repeating himself like that, something bad was about to be said, and whatever it was, you didn't want to be the one who agreed with it or disagreed with it. You just waited. Brock laughed, a real laugh, loud and cutting. Somebody is going to be very embarrassed today, and it isn't going to be me. He dropped the bracket on the registration table and walked away, coffee cup still in hand, already bored by the conversation he had just started. But 3 rows behind the registration line, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, wearing a plain gray training shirt and standard issue shorts, had heard every word. Ava Carter turned back to her own registration form and finished writing without looking up. Her hand didn't shake. Her expression didn't change. She picked up her copy of the bracket, folded it twice, slid it into her pocket, and walked toward the warm-up field. Sergeant First Class Diana Okafor, Ava's supervising officer and the woman who had personally submitted her name for the tournament, was waiting near the edge of the field with 2 water bottles and an expression that said she had also heard everything Brock said. You good? Diana asked. I'm good, Ava said. You heard him. I heard him. Diana handed her a water bottle. And Ava unscrewed the cap and took a long drink. Then she looked out at the warm-up field where a dozen soldiers were already moving through drills. And nothing. He's not wrong that people are going to be watching me differently today. That doesn't bother you, Ava considered the question like it deserved a real answer. It bothers me the same way bad weather bothers me. It's a condition. You account for it. You don't fight it. Diana studied her for a moment. In 11 years of military service, she had learned to read people not just what they said, but how they stood when they said it, whether their shoulders were carrying something they hadn't named yet. Ava Carter stood the way a person stands when they have already done the hard internal work before anyone else even knew there was hard work to do. Reynolds is going to come after you specifically, Diana said quietly. You know that. I know that. Not just in the ring. He's going to try to get in your head before you even reach the bracket match. Ava nodded slowly. Then I need to be somewhere he can't reach. She tapped the side of her head with 2 fingers. Up here. She set the water bottle down and began her warm-up. Diana watched her go. Then she looked across the field toward where Brock Reynolds was holding court with his group of trainees, talking loudly about something making them laugh. She had known Brock for 6 years. She had filed 2 informal complaints against him. Both had gone nowhere. She picked up her own water bottle and told herself that today might be different. She almost believed it. The first match of the day was scheduled for 9 in the morning. By 8:45, word had already spread through the entire base. A woman was in the bracket. Not a female officer sitting in the stands. Not a female medic or logistics coordinator. An actual competitor. A Navy SEAL with a record that when the younger soldiers bothered to look it up on the base intranet was quietly extraordinary. Graduated in the top 4% of her SEAL training class, 2 combat deployments, a commendation for close quarters engagement that had been partially classified and couldn't be fully read without clearance. Most of the soldiers who looked up her record shared the same reaction as surprised, then quiet. Then they went and found their friends and said, "Hey, have you seen her record?" But there were others who didn't bother looking anything up, who made up their minds in the 2 seconds it took Brock Reynolds to just say her name out loud and laugh. Those soldiers were the loudest that morning. When Ava walked out onto the competition field for her first match, a sound moved through the crowd that was not quite a cheer and not quite a laugh. Something in between, something that had teeth. She heard it, she registered it, and she filed it away in the same place she filed wind and direction and distance calculations useful data. Emotional weather accounted for. Her first opponent was a Marine corporal named Hicks. He was 6 feet even, with the kind of upper body that suggested he spent most of his free time in the weight room. He looked at Ava the way most of her first opponents looked at her, with a combination of discomfort and something that looked almost like pity. "I'm not going to go easy on you," he said quietly before the referee signaled start. Not cruel, almost apologetic, like he was warning her. "Good," Ava said. "Don't." The match lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It wasn't that Ava was faster than Hicks exactly. It was that she was faster in the right moments. When he committed to a strike, she was already moving away from it. When he shifted his weight to power a throw, she had already read the weight shift half a beat before it happened and adjusted her position. She didn't overpower him. She didn't need to. Every time he tried to dictate the terms of the fight, she quietly, efficiently declined. The takedown that ended it was clean and controlled. Hicks hit the mat, tapped out, and looked up at the ceiling of the open-air training area with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already figured out. The crowd's reaction was complicated. Some soldiers applauded genuinely openly. Others shifted on their feet. A few exchanged glances with the people next to them. From the far side of the field, Brock Reynolds watched the match with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "Beginner's luck," he said to nobody in particular. But Leo Torres, standing 2 feet to his left, noticed that Brock hadn't looked away from the ring for the entire 4 minutes. Ava's second match came 40 minutes later. This time the crowd was bigger. Word had spread the way word spreads on a military base, fast, unreliable, and loud. People were describing the first match to soldiers who hadn't seen it, each retelling, adding a layer of drama that may or may not have been accurate. By the time Ava walked out for her second fight, there were at least 200 people standing around the competition area, which was twice the usual number for an early round match. Her second opponent was an Army Ranger named Corporal Webb. He was 210 pounds, had a background in wrestling, and he had watched the first match from the second row. He didn't look apologetic, he looked focused. The referee signaled the start, and Webb moved immediately low, driving forward with his legs trying to close the distance and take the fight to the ground where his wrestling would neutralize her speed. It was a smart strategy, technically correct. Ava let him come. She sidestepped at the last possible moment, just enough to redirect his momentum rather than absorb it. And as Webb drove past her, she caught his arm at the elbow and redirected him into the mat with a control technique that was so efficient it looked almost gentle. Webb rolled, recovered, came back up. His expression had shifted from focused to genuinely engaged. This was a real fight now, and he knew it. They went 2 more exchanges. Webb was good. He adapted faster than most. He stopped going for the big, powerful shots and started working angles, testing her reactions, looking for patterns. He found one 3 minutes in, a slight hesitation in her left side when she absorbed a check. He exploited it immediately, got inside her guard, and for 4 seconds actually had a dominant position. The crowd made a sound, and Ava did something none of them expected. She laughed. Not loud, not theatrical. A short, quiet exhale of genuine amusement, the kind of sound that belongs in a sparring session between two people who both know what they're doing. It lasted maybe a half second. Webb blinked, and in that fraction of distraction, Ava had already reversed the position. She took him down 30 seconds later. Webb tapped, sat up, looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that had no hostility in it at all. "You're good," he said. "You're good too," she said, and she meant it. It was the most natural exchange anyone had seen on that field all morning. And for some reason, more than the technique or the takedowns, it was that moment, that simple exchange of two professional fighters acknowledging each other, that stayed with the soldiers who saw it. Because Brock Reynolds, in 3 years of winning tournaments, had never once said that to an opponent. By the time the midday break arrived, Ava had won 3 matches. The base was talking about nothing else. In the mess hall, at the equipment stations near the medical tent, everywhere soldiers gathered during the break, the conversation bent toward the same subject. Some were genuinely impressed. Some were frustrated in ways they hadn't fully examined yet. And a small number were loudly, aggressively dismissive in a way that revealed more about them than they intended. Brock Reynolds sat at a table with 4 of his senior trainees and ate without speaking for 7 minutes, which was unusual for him. He was the kind of man who always had something to say. Finally, Corporal Marsh said carefully, "She's doing well this morning." Brock looked up from his food. Marsh realized immediately he had said the wrong thing and started to correct course. "I mean, for what she's doing well," Brock said, flat, factual, like the words tasted bad. Nobody at the table said anything else for a while. Then Brock pushed his tray aside and looked at the bracket sheet he had been ignoring since morning. He studied it for a long moment. "If she wins her afternoon match, she's in my bracket tomorrow." Leo Torres looked at his food. "She's going to be in my bracket tomorrow," Brock said again, and something in his voice had shifted. It was no longer amusement. It wasn't quite anger either. It was something older and darker, the specific emotion of a man whose story about the world has just been interrupted and who is deciding how to rewrite it. "You'll handle it," Marsh said, because he thought that was what Brock wanted to hear. Brock stared at the bracket. "I'll handle it," he agreed. But the way he said it made Torres set down his fork. That afternoon, as the second round of matches began, Ava was aware of a change in the quality of the attention around her. The morning crowd had been curious. The afternoon crowd was watching with the focused intensity of people who have decided they care about what happens next. She could feel it not as pressure, but as information. The way a pilot feels turbulence, not as danger, but as data. It told her what kind of room she was in. It told her what the stakes had become. Her afternoon opponent was a mixed martial arts specialist named Sergeant Cole. He had a professional record outside the military and moved with the loose, easy confidence of someone who had been in front of crowds before. He also had 25 pounds on her, a 4-inch reach advantage, and the fact that he was genuinely dangerous. Sergeant First Class Diana Okafor stood at the edge of the field with her arms folded and watched Ava square up with Cole, and felt something she hadn't felt in a professional capacity in a very long time. She felt nervous, not because she didn't believe in Ava, because she did, and because she understood for the first time exactly how much weight was sitting on the outcome of this match. Not just for today, not just for the bracket, but for every female soldier on this base who had filed a complaint that went nowhere, who had been talked over in briefings, who had been handed the easier assignment, not because they wanted it, but because someone decided for them. Cole opened with a combination that was technically crisp and genuinely fast. Ava covered and redirected, and the exchange ended with both of them back at distance. Cole raised an eyebrow. "Okay," he said. They went 5 full minutes. Cole was the best opponent Ava had faced that day. He was smart, athletic, and experienced, and he adjusted his approach twice after Ava neutralized his initial strategies. He got a point scored against her in the 3rd minute on a clean combination that she covered too slowly. The crowd exhaled, and then something shifted in Ava. Not panic, not desperation. Something quieter than that. Diana, watching from the sideline, would describe it later as focus dropping to a different level, like a lens sharpening. Iva stopped reacting to Cole. She started reading him. There is a difference between a fighter who responds to what is happening and a fighter who anticipates what is about to happen. The gap between those two things is narrow and invisible to most observers, but it changes everything about how a fight moves. For the last 2 minutes, Ava Carter stopped responding. She scored 3 points in 90 seconds on openings that Cole did not know were openings until they had already become problems. The final takedown was controlled, technically precise, and ended the match without drama. Cole stood up, rolled his shoulder, and looked at her with open respect. "Who trained you?" "My father mostly," Ava said. Cole nodded slowly. "Your father did good work." Ava went still for just a moment, a single beat, invisible to almost everyone watching. Then she nodded once. "Yes," she said quietly, "he did." Diana saw that moment. She was close enough to read it. She made a note of it the way you make a note of something that matters, but that you are not going to ask about. Not yet. As the afternoon matches concluded and soldiers began moving toward the evening briefings, en masse, the bracket results were posted on the official boards near the administration tent. A crowd gathered immediately, because 2 names now sat in the same bracket column for the following morning: Sergeant Brock Reynolds and Petty Officer Ava Carter, U.S. Navy SEAL. A private named Daniels, 19 years old and 3 months into his first posting, stared at the board for a long time. He had grown up in a small town in Georgia. He had joined the Army because his grandfather had served, and he believed in service the way his grandfather had taught him to believe in it as something serious, something that demanded the best of you. He had also, before today, believed what most of the people around him believed, that there was a natural ceiling on what a woman could do in a combat context, not because he was cruel, because nobody had ever shown him otherwise. He stared at the bracket board. Then he found Torres nearby. "Hey, you've seen Reynolds fight. What happens tomorrow?" Torres was quiet for a moment. He had known Brock Reynolds for 3 years. He had also watched every one of Ava's matches that day. "Honestly," Torres said. "Yeah." Torres looked at the board. "I don't know. And that's the first time I've been able to say that about a Reynolds bracket match." Daniels thought about that. "Is that good or bad?" Daniels asked. Torres picked up his gear bag. "Ask me tomorrow." That night, while most of the base wound down, Ava sat alone in the small preparation room, allocated to competitors, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, and a paper printout of Brock Reynolds' recorded match history spread across the floor in front of her. She had asked Diana to get it for her that afternoon. It was 16 pages long. She read every page twice. Brock Reynolds was powerful, aggressive, and technically proficient. His record showed 41 wins in tournament settings, 9 of them by dominant early decision, and the rest by increasingly large margins as his opponents tried to match his physical intensity and failed. He had 1 loss on record from 4 years ago against a senior instructor who had since retired. Ava read the description of that loss twice. It was the most useful page in the document, because the description noted that Brock's 1 loss came when his opponent refused to engage with him on his terms, refused to match his energy, refused to react to his taunting, and controlled the pace of the fight. From outside the range where Brock's power was most dangerous, the senior instructor who beat him had been patient. He had been disciplined. He had made Brock come to him again and again until Brock's aggression became his own undoing. Ava set the papers down and stared at the ceiling. Her father's voice came to her, then the way it had been coming to her all day in quiet moments. He had been a decorated combat veteran, a man who believed that fighting was a skill like any other skill, something you learn not by brute force, but by attention, by patience, by the kind of respect for an opponent that required you to understand them before you tried to defeat them. She had been 10 years old the first time he showed her a defensive hold. Not aggressive, defensive. He had told her, the goal is never to hurt someone. The goal is to stop being hurt. If you know the difference, you'll always fight cleaner than someone who doesn't. She was 24 now. He had been gone for 2 years, a training accident, not combat, which felt like the cruelest kind of irony for a man who had survived 2 wars. She still heard his voice most clearly when the stakes were highest, as if he knew she needed him most in those moments. She gathered the papers, folded them, and put them in her bag. Then she lay down on the narrow cot in the preparation room, stared at the dark ceiling, and let herself breathe. Tomorrow was coming, whether she was ready or not. She planned to be ready. Across the base in the senior officers' quarters, 3 Pentagon-attached observers, who had been on the base for the past 48 hours, were having a conversation about what they had seen that day. Their names were not listed on any public roster. Their presence on the base was officially described in paperwork as a training observation evaluation. It was not a training observation evaluation. They were scouts, recruitment assessors, looking for something specific, something the standard metrics and performance reviews often couldn't quantify. A quality that showed up in how a person handled pressure, not just in whether they could lift a certain weight or run a certain distance. One of the observers, a woman named Colonel Rice, who had spent 22 years in special operations, set down her coffee cup and looked at the other two. "Carter," she said. The other two nodded. "I want to see tomorrow's match before I make any decisions," she added. "But Carter." They all looked at the bracket sheet, and all three of them independently thought the same thing: tomorrow's going to be something nobody on this base will forget. Outside, across the darkened training field, the combat ring stood empty under the stars, waiting. The morning of the second day arrived the way trouble always arrives on a military base, quietly at first and then all at once. By 6 in the morning, before the mess hall had finished its first breakfast rotation, every soldier on Fort Hardin already knew two things. First, that Ava Carter had gone undefeated through 4 matches the previous day, and second, that she was now in Brock Reynolds' bracket. Those two facts together created a specific kind of energy on the base, the kind you could feel in how people held their coffee cups, in how conversations stopped when the wrong person walked by, in how even the youngest privates, the ones who barely understood the tournament structure, understood instinctively that something was going to happen today that mattered. Leo Torres had not slept well. He told himself it was the cot. The cots in the shared quarters building were notoriously uncomfortable, and he had complained about his at least a dozen times since arriving at Fort Hardin 3 months ago. But that morning, lying awake at 5:45, watching the ceiling get slowly lighter, he knew it wasn't the cot. It was Brock. More specifically, it was the way Brock had looked at that bracket sheet the night before. Torres had been around enough men with enough unchecked power to recognize the specific expression Brock had worn, not anger exactly, not yet. Something more dangerous than anger. The quiet, cold calculation of a man who has decided that the outcome of tomorrow is not going to be left to chance. Torres got up, got dressed, and went to find Corporal Marsh. He found him near the equipment station refilling a water bottle. "Did you talk to Reynolds this morning?" Torres asked. Marsh looked up. Something shifted in his expression, a small, quick thing, the kind of shift that told Torres the answer before Marsh said a word. "Yeah, briefly." And Marsh capped the water bottle. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Marsh was the kind of person who filled silence automatically, reflexively, as if he was afraid of what silence might say if it was given room. The fact that he was choosing his words now meant something. "He's focused," Marsh finally said. "Focused how?" "Focused like I've never seen him before." Marsh looked at Torres. "He was up at 4. He ran 8 miles. He's been in the training room since 5. Marsh paused. "He's not treating this like a tournament match." Torres absorbed that. "What's he treating it like?" Marsh picked up his gear bag and slung it over his shoulder. "I don't know exactly. But when I walked in this morning, he looked at me and said, 'She's not leaving that ring on her own feet.'" And the way he said it, Marsh stopped, shook his head. "I don't know, Torres. I don't know what today looks like." Torres watched him walk away. Then he looked across the base toward the competition field and thought about a 24-year-old woman who had spent last night reading match history reports and sleeping on a narrow cot. He thought about going to find Sergeant Okafor, about saying something, about doing something. He thought about Brock Reynolds' career and what it could do to his own. He picked up his own gear bag and went to get breakfast. It was a decision he would spend a long time thinking about afterward. Ava was already on the warm-up field at 6:15. She was not running drills. She was not running at all. She was sitting cross-legged on the edge of the field with her eyes closed and her hands resting on her knees, breathing in a slow, controlled rhythm that made her look less like a combat athlete and more like someone who had found a quiet room inside herself that nobody else had access to. Diana Okafor arrived at 6:20 with 2 coffees and stopped when she saw Ava's posture. She stood there for a moment, both cups in hand, and watched. In 22 years of military service, Diana had worked alongside hundreds of fighters. She had seen pre-competition rituals of every variety, pacing shadow boxing music, anger, prayer, silence. She had learned to read those rituals the way you read weather as information about what kind of day you were going to have. Ava's stillness told her something specific. It told her that Ava had already done the internal work, that she had already been through the storm, the fear, the doubt, the calculation of risk, and had come out the other side of it sometime in the night while everyone else was sleeping. What remained now was not preparation. It was just waiting. Diana sat down next to her and held out a coffee. Ava opened her eyes, took it, and said, "Thank you." "How'd you sleep?" 4 hours. Enough." Diana nodded. She looked at the field. "Reynolds was in the training room at 5 this morning." "I heard." Diana turned to look at her. "From Hutai, base travels fast." Ava took a sip of coffee. "He's scared." Diana raised an eyebrow. "Brock Reynolds doesn't get scared." "Everyone gets scared," Ava said simply. "The ones who can't admit it are the most dangerous because they turn it into something else." She paused. "He's turned it into rage, which means he's going to come at me harder than he's ever come at anyone. And he's going to make mistakes he wouldn't normally make." Diana was quiet for a moment. "And you?" Ava looked at her coffee cup. "My father used to say that the only fighter you can't beat is one who has nothing to prove, who shows up just to do the work and go home." She looked up. "I don't have anything to prove today. I already proved it yesterday." "Then what are you here for?" Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Diana didn't expect. "Because he called me an embarrassment in front of my peers on a base where I serve." Her voice didn't harden when she said it. It went quieter, which was somehow more serious. "I'm not here to prove a point. I'm here because this is where I'm supposed to be. And nobody, not him, not the crowd, not anyone gets to decide that for me." Diana looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her own coffee and said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay," and somehow that single word held more weight than a speech would have. The morning rounds began at 8. The crowd that gathered for the early matches was noticeably larger than the previous day. Word had traveled not just across the base, but to surrounding facilities. Soldiers who had been on duty the previous day and missed Ava's matches had requested schedule adjustments to be present today. 2 civilian contractors working on base infrastructure had positioned themselves near the perimeter of the competition area without anyone formally inviting them. Even the 3 Pentagon observers who had maintained careful professional distance the day before were present and notably closer to the field than they had been. Brock Reynolds arrived at 8:15. He didn't walk onto the field the way he usually walked, with the loose, easy swagger of a man who had already decided the outcome. He walked onto the field the way a machine moves. Economical. Locked in. He wore a gray training shirt with the sleeves cut off, and when he shook out his hands and rolled his neck, the muscles in his shoulders moved with a density that made several watching soldiers exchange glances. He looked at the crowd. He didn't look at Ava. That itself was a tell. Torres noticed it from 15 feet away. Brock always looked at his opponents during warm-up. He made a point of it, finding their eyes holding the contact, demonstrating that he owned the space before a single exchange had taken place. The fact that he was deliberately not looking at Ava meant she was already inside his head, taking up so much space that he couldn't afford to look at her directly. Torres filed that information away and said nothing. Brock's morning bracket matches were not elegant. They were not meant to be. He moved through his first 2 opponents with the focused brutality of someone who is not fighting the person in front of them, but rehearsing for the fight that comes after. His first opponent, a young Army corporal who had performed well the previous day, went down in under 90 seconds. His second lasted 3 minutes only because Brock seemed to deliberately extend it as if he was making a point about endurance. The crowd responded to Brock the way it always had, loudly, with the specific admiration reserved for men who embody a certain kind of obvious physical power. Cheers, applause, some shouting from his regular supporters in the crowd. But something was different this time. It was subtle enough that most people missed it. But Torres saw it, and Diana Okafor saw it, and Colonel Rice, standing 30 feet back with her 2 colleagues, saw it clearly. The crowd was divided, not evenly, but genuinely. A significant portion of the soldiers watching Brock's matches were not cheering. Some were watching with neutral expressions. Some were watching with expressions that were harder to read, something between discomfort and assessment. A few were actively quiet in ways that communicated more than noise would have. The base had shifted overnight, not completely, not irreversibly, but it had shifted. And Brock Reynolds, who had spent 3 years believing the base was entirely and unanimously his, had not yet registered the change. Ava's morning match came at 9:40. Her opponent was a Special Forces sergeant named Vance, who had gone quietly undefeated through his own bracket and who had, unlike most of her previous opponents, done his research. He had spent time the night before with people who had watched her matches, asking specific questions about her patterns, her tendencies, her reaction time. He came out smart and careful, fighting with the disciplined patience of someone who had decided not to make assumptions. It was the most challenging match Ava had faced in the tournament. Vance didn't overcommit. He didn't try to overpower her. He worked angles, kept distance, forced exchanges that were genuinely technical. For the first 3 minutes, the match was close enough that the scoring referee had to watch every second carefully. The crowd, which had been expecting something more one-sided after yesterday's matches, grew very still. This was different. This was two skilled people at the edge of their abilities, and the crowd could feel it the way you feel a weather change before you can see it. 4 minutes in, Ava made an adjustment, a small one barely visible unless you were watching her footwork specifically. She had identified something in Vance's defensive pattern, a slight delay in his right side recovery after an outgoing exchange, and she began setting it up, not rushing toward it, building toward it. The way you build toward a conclusion in an argument, laying the groundwork 3 steps before you need it. The opening came at 5 minutes and 20 seconds. She took it. The takedown was clean, controlled, decisive. Vance tapped, sat up, took a breath. "That delay on my right," he said. "You saw it early." "Third exchange," Ava said. Vance nodded slowly. "I'll work on that." He extended his hand. She shook it. The applause that followed was the loudest Ava had received in the tournament. And it was coming from every direction now, not just one pocket of supporters, but spread across the entire viewing area, a broad, genuine sound that said the crowd had made a collective decision about what they were watching. From across the field, Brock Reynolds heard it. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. But the man standing next to him, Corporal Marsh, watched Brock's right hand close slowly into a fist and then release. Close and release. The way a pressure valve cycles when something inside is building faster than it can safely escape. The afternoon bracket was posted at 11. Reynolds versus Carter, 2 o'clock. 3 hours. Those 3 hours had a specific texture on the base. The kind of time that doesn't move normally, too slow in some moments, suddenly too fast in others. Soldiers who had afternoon duties found ways to be near the competition area by 1:45. The mess hall cleared out faster than usual at lunch. Even the base operations center, which had its own rhythms entirely separate from any tournament, was running lean on personnel by 1:30 because the people who were supposed to be there had found reasons to be somewhere else. Diana Okafor spent the 3 hours close to Ava without hovering. She was present without being intrusive, checking in, providing water, handling the logistical details. So Ava didn't have to think about anything except the match ahead. It was the specific kind of support that only comes from someone who has been in high-stakes situations themselves and knows that what a person needs in those moments is not more information or more advice. It is the quiet presence of someone who believes in them without condition. At 1:15, Torres did something he had been arguing with himself about all morning. He walked across the base to the administration office and asked to speak with Sergeant Major Harris, the senior, non-commissioned officer overseeing the tournament. Harris was a 53-year-old veteran with 30 years of service and the specific economy of expression that comes from having said everything important so many times you no longer feel the need to decorate it. Torres stood in front of his desk and said, "I have a concern about the 2 o'clock match." Harris looked at him. "Sit down." Torres sat. "Talk," Harris said. Torres talked. He described what Marsh had told him that morning. He described the way Brock had looked at the bracket sheet the night before. He described the comment, "She's not leaving that ring on her own feet," and what it had sounded like when Brock said it. He described the fist closing and releasing during Ava's applause. He described all of it carefully and specifically, the way he had been trained to report information without editorializing, without interpretation, just the facts as he had observed them. Harris listened without interrupting. When Torres finished, Harris was quiet for a moment. "Reynolds has a history," Harris said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "And you believe today is different?" Torres thought about how to answer that honestly. I believe today is the first time Reynolds has faced a situation where the outcome isn't guaranteed, and I don't know what he does when that happens. Harris studied him. You're putting your name on this report. Yes, Sergeant Major. Harris nodded slowly. He picked up his radio. He made 3 calls. Torres heard the words additional oversight and protocol review and 2 o'clock match. And then Harris set the radio down and looked at Torres with an expression that communicated several things at once, the primary one being, I heard you. Now go. Torres went. Walking back across the base, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not quite. Something more complicated, the specific weight of a person who has done the right thing and cannot yet tell whether it will matter. At 1:50, Ava stood at the edge of the competition field. The crowd around the ring was the largest it had been for any match in the tournament's 11-year history. Soldiers were standing 4 and 5 deep in some places. The perimeter ropes were doing the work of crowd control, but only barely. The sound was low and continuous, the kind of collective murmur that happens when a large group of people are all restraining the same impulse. Diana stood beside her. How do you feel? Clear, Ava said. That's good. My father used to say that before any high-stakes situation, you have one job. Get quiet enough inside that you can hear what's actually happening, not what you're afraid might happen. Ava looked at the ring. I'm quiet. Diana looked at her profile, at the stillness in her face, at the way her hands hung loose and easy at her sides. You know he's going to come at you with everything. I know. And you know the crowd is going to be complicated. I know that too. Diana paused. What else do you know? Ava turned to look at Sear, and for the first time that day, something moved across her expression that wasn't calm or calculation. Something human and unguarded. Something that said she was 24 years old, and she had lost her father 2 years ago, and she was standing in front of 500 people who had spent the past 24 hours arguing about whether she belonged here. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and she was going to walk into that ring anyway. I know, Ava said quietly, that he needs this win more than I do, and that makes me more dangerous than he understands. Then she rolled her shoulders back, exhaled slowly, and walked toward the ring. Across the field, Brock Reynolds watched her come, and for one unguarded moment, one single second, that nobody was close enough to read except Torres, who happened to be standing at exactly the wrong angle at exactly the right time, Brock's expression did something it never did in public. It flickered, not fear, not quite, but the shadow of something that fear lives near. The shadow of a man realizing for the first time that the story he has been telling himself might not be the story that is actually happening. It lasted 1 second. Then his face closed back into hard lines, and he rolled his neck and moved forward. The referee called both fighters to the center. 500 soldiers went quiet. Colonel Rice, standing in the back with her 2 colleagues, uncrossed her arms and leaned slightly forward, a movement so small that neither of her colleagues noticed it, but which represented for a woman of her discipline something close to the edge of her seat. Sergeant Major Harris had quietly positioned 2 additional senior referees at the edge of the ring. Nobody announced this. Nobody explained it. But Torres, watching from 20 feet back, saw them arrive and felt something in his chest loosen by a fraction. The referee looked at Brock, looked at Ava. Tournament rules apply, and he said, control contact, tap or call signals of submission. Any escalation beyond sanction and protocol results in immediate disqualification. He said it looking at both of them, but the words were aimed at one. Brock stared past him at Ava. Ava looked at the referee and nodded once. Ready? The referee asked. Brock set his jaw. Ready. Ava breathed out. Ready. The referee stepped back, and Brock Reynolds moved. He came forward faster than his size suggested he could move, with the focused aggression of a man who had decided in the dark hours of early morning that this match was not going to last long enough for patience to become relevant. He threw a combination designed not just to score, but to establish immediately and completely that he was the largest force in this ring and that everything else was going to happen on his terms. Ava moved left, not back, left, outside his power line where his combination ended in empty air. He turned and came again. She moved right. The crowd made a sound, not a cheer, not quite. The sound of 500 people registering simultaneously that what they were watching was not what they expected. Brock's third combination was harder, faster, his weight fully committed. It was the kind of attack that ended most of his fights before the first minute was over. Ava wasn't there when it arrived. She had already moved, and in the space where his momentum carried him slightly past his own balance point, she was at his side, redirecting rather than absorbing, applying just enough pressure at exactly the right angle. Brock stumbled, recovered, turned. His expression had changed. The calculation was gone. Something rawer had replaced it. Something that was not yet rage, but was moving in that direction with the specific velocity of a large object on a slope. The crowd was completely silent now, because every soldier on that field, from the most experienced veteran to the youngest private, understood what they were watching. Ava Carter was not fighting Brock Reynolds. She was letting Brock Reynolds fight himself. And she was doing it with a precision and a patience that was, in its own quiet way, the most devastating thing anyone had seen in 11 years of this tournament. Brock came at her again and again. Each time the outcome was the same, his force redirected. His power absorbed and returned at angles he hadn't accounted for. His aggression met not with counter-aggression, but with something more unsettling. Silence, movement, control. He was 2 minutes into the match, and he had not landed a clean strike. And everyone watching could see it, including Brock. He stopped in the center of the ring chest, heaving, and stared at her. And for the first time in 3 years of tournament wins, in 11 years of military service, in a lifetime of being the largest and loudest and most powerful person in any room he entered, Sergeant Brock Reynolds looked at his opponent and did not know what to do next. The crowd felt it. Even the soldiers who had spent the past 24 hours insisting he would destroy her felt it. Because you can't hide that moment. Not in front of 500 people. Not when the cameras are rolling. Not when senior officers are watching from the sideline and Pentagon observers are standing 30 feet away. That moment lives in the open air, visible to everyone. And Brock Reynolds, who had built his entire identity on never being in that moment, was standing in the center of it. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Brock Reynolds did what men like Brock Reynolds always do when they run out of strategy. He got loud. "Stop dancing!" he shouted across the ring, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. His voice had that particular edge, not quite a crack, but close to the sound of something under pressure that hasn't broken yet, but is close enough that you can hear it thinking about it. "Fight me. Stop running and fight me like you mean it." Ava didn't answer. She moved her weight slightly to her left heel, reset her breathing, watched him. That silence, her silence, hit Brock harder than any counterstrike could have, because he had been using his voice as a weapon his entire career. The taunts, the volume, the performative contempt, all of it designed to get inside an opponent's head and make them react emotionally. Make them sloppy. Make them his. Ava Carter treated his voice like weather. She accounted for it and moved on. "Say something," Brock snapped, stepping forward. "You think you're better than me? Say it. Say it to my face." From the sideline, Torres watched Brock's footwork and felt his stomach drop. Because Brock was stepping forward without a plan. He was moving on emotion now, not technique. And a 230-pound man moving on pure emotion inside a combat ring was not a controlled situation. It was a countdown. Sergeant Major Harris, standing 15 feet from the ring, with his arms behind his back, had already tilted his head slightly toward one of the additional referees he had positioned there. A small movement, a readiness signal. The 2-minute mark hit. Brock came forward with a combination that was harder than anything he'd thrown, yet less technique, more raw power. The kind of attack built on the belief that if you hit something hard enough and often enough, it has to eventually give. His right hand was the primary weapon, loaded with everything he had aimed directly at Ava's shoulder to stagger her and create an opening. She slipped it by 2 inches. And while his momentum carried his arm through empty air, she stepped inside his guard and landed 2 short, precise strikes to his ribs. Not brutal, not theatrical, just accurate. The kind of strikes that don't look like much from the outside but communicate very clearly to the body that registers them. "I know exactly where you are, and you do not know where I am." Brock sucked in a sharp breath and stepped back. The crowd exhaled collectively. Corporal Marsh, who had spent the past 2 days telling everyone who would listen that Brock was going to dismantle Ava Carter inside of 3 minutes, turned to the soldier standing next to him and said nothing. He just stared at the ring with his mouth slightly open. Brock rolled his shoulders and reset. His jaw was tight. The muscle above his ear was working in a way that meant his teeth were clenched hard enough to hurt. "Lucky," he said, low this time. "Not for the crowd, just for her." Ava looked at him and said nothing. That nothing was the most devastating response she could have given him. 2 minutes 30 seconds. Brock changed tactics. He stopped leading with power combinations and started trying to close distance, get inside, get his weight involved, use the size differential that had ended so many of his previous fights. It was technically smarter. It suggested that somewhere under the rage there was still a fighter paying attention. He got inside her guard once. For 4 seconds he had positioned his mass working in his favor, his weight pressing forward, and for the first time in the match, Ava was working to maintain her footing rather than moving freely. The crowd made a sound. Brock felt it. And for one moment, something lit up in his eyes that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who has found familiar ground after too long on terrain he didn't recognize. Then Ava did something that nobody in the crowd expected. She stopped resisting. Not completely, not carelessly, but she shifted her weight in a direction that felt like yielding, and Brock, conditioned by 2.5 minutes of pushing against resistance that always moved away from him, pushed harder into the space she opened up. And the moment his weight committed fully forward, she was already rotating, redirecting his momentum at an angle he had no framework to recover from, and the takedown that followed was the cleanest thing anyone had seen in the ring all tournament. Brock hit the mat hard. The sound was not a tap. It was a full-body impact, the sound of 230 pounds of committed momentum arriving somewhere it hadn't planned to go. The crowd erupted. Not all of it, but enough of it. A wave of sound that started near the front of the crowd and moved backward through the standing rows until it had covered the entire perimeter of the competition field. Somewhere in the middle of that sound were individual voices, soldiers who had not made noise all tournament, who had watched carefully and quietly, now releasing something that had been building since yesterday morning. Brock was on his back on the mat. He lay there for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then he got up. He always got up. That was the thing about Brock Reynolds that even people who disliked him couldn't argue with. He got up every time, without exception. It was the one quality he had that was entirely genuine, entirely unperformed. He got up because he could not conceive of not getting up. It wasn't courage exactly. It was more fundamental than courage. It was simply the only option his body understood. He got up, and his face had changed completely. The strategy was gone now. The last of it. What remained was something much older and much simpler, the face of a man who has been publicly humiliated and is no longer fighting to win. He is fighting to destroy. Torres saw it happen. Harris saw it happen. Rice, 30 feet back, saw it happen and took one step forward without thinking about it. Brock walked toward Ava. Not rushed, almost slow. The specific slowness of someone who has stopped calculating outcomes entirely and is operating on something that precedes calculation. "You think that counts?" His voice was very low now, almost conversational, which was somehow worse than the shouting. "You think that means something?" Ava reset her stance, breathing controlled. Eyes on his center mass, watching his hips, not his hands, the way her father had taught her at age 12 in their driveway in Arizona. "Watch the hips. Hands are liars. Hips always tell the truth." "Match continues," the referee said sharply. Both fighters reset. Brock didn't look at the referee. He looked at Ava. "I've been doing this for 15 years. 15 years. And you think 2.5 minutes gives you..." "Sergeant Reynolds?" The referee's voice had shifted to the specific register of official warning. "Reset, now." Brock reset, technically. His feet moved to the starting position, but his eyes didn't leave Ava's face, and the quality of his attention had the specific fixed character of something that is not going to be redirected by a referee's voice or a tournament rule or anything short of a physical barrier. 3 minutes. Brock came again. Different this time, smarter, lower, less about the single big strike and more about incremental pressure. He was trying to wear her down, to make the match longer than her stamina could sustain. He was betting on his size advantage in a war of attrition. It was objectively his best strategy at this point, and it almost worked. For 90 seconds, Brock controlled the pace. He pushed. She redirected. He pushed again. She redirected again. But each exchange was slightly shorter than the one before, and each time she reset her breathing had to do a little more work. The crowd felt the shift and went quiet again, a different quality of quiet this time with more anxiety in it. Diana Okafor stood at the edge of the field with her arms crossed and her jaw tight and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Ava knew her own body. Ava knew this match. Diana's job was to be present, not to interfere, and she understood that distinction the way only someone who has had to trust another person completely can understand it. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Brock got inside again. This time he held the position longer. His weight, his strength grinding rather than striking, trying to exhaust her defense through attrition rather than overwhelm it through power. And for 6 seconds it worked. Ava was holding redirecting working, and the effort of it was visible in a way that the earlier parts of the match had not been. The crowd leaned forward. Brock felt the crowd lean forward and pushed harder. And that was the mistake. Because the moment he felt the crowd's energy and let it feed him, the moment he stopped reading Ava and started performing for the audience, he left an opening. Small, specific. The same type of opening she had identified in Vance's defense the previous day, the same type her father had taught her to find and wait for and then take without hesitation. Ava took it. The reversal was so fast that several soldiers in the front row genuinely weren't sure what had happened until it was already over. One moment Brock had position, the next Ava had rotated through a movement that used his forward pressure as the primary force of its execution, and Brock was face first toward the mat with her controlling his arm at an angle that was very close to the edge of what the joint was designed to tolerate. He went down. He didn't tap. The referee moved in immediately. Tap or call. Brock's jaw was against the mat. His arm was at a controlled angle. His free hand was pressed flat against the ground, not tapping. Refusing. Tap or call Reynolds. The crowd had gone completely silent. Torres was holding his breath. And then through a maw clenched tight enough to crack, Brock Reynolds said one word. Out. It was barely audible, but the referee heard it and it counted. He signaled the end of the exchange. Ava released immediately and stepped back. Brock got up for the second time. The applause that followed from the crowd was enormous, louder than anything the tournament had produced in 2 days. And this time there was no ambivalence in it. This time it was coming from everywhere. From soldiers who had spent yesterday dismissing her. From soldiers who had never believed it was possible. From soldiers who had believed all along and were releasing 2 days of tension in a single sound. Private Daniels, standing in the 5th row, found himself clapping before he had made a conscious decision to do so. He looked at his own hands for a moment, as if they had surprised him. Then he kept clapping. Brock Reynolds stood in the center of the ring. His chest was heaving. His face was a study in a specific kind of humiliation. The humiliation of a man who has been beaten on the terms he established, using the rules he agreed to in front of everyone he needed to impress. The scoring referee confirmed the tally. Ava was ahead. With the match in its final phase, Brock Reynolds had 1 minute remaining and no path to victory through legitimate means. Every soldier on that field who understood fighting understood this. Every senior officer watching understood it. The 3 Pentagon observers understood it. And Brock understood it too. That understanding is where things went wrong. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. Brock moved forward for the final exchange. Ava reset and read his approach lower than his previous attacks, faster with the weight distribution of someone going for a decisive takedown attempt. She was already calculating the counter, already positioning for the redirection. But Brock didn't go for the takedown. At the last possible moment, he pulled up short and stopped. And in the half second that Ava's body was committed to the counter for the attack he hadn't completed, Brock swung his leg back full force. No control, no technique. The kind of raw physical violence that has nothing to do with sport and everything to do with rage, and drove it directly toward her midsection. The referee screamed, "Reynolds, stop!" Harris had his radio out. Rice was moving forward. The crowd made a sound that was not a cheer and not a gasp, but something that had never been heard at this tournament before, the collective vocalization of 500 people watching something cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. Brock's leg was already in motion. And Ava Carter, Navy SEAL, 24 years old, trained since the age of 10 by a father who believed that the goal was never to hurt someone, but always to stop being hurt. Ava Carter made a decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She didn't step back. She stepped in. Her hands found his leg mid-arc. Both of them precise as instruments, reading the momentum and the angle, the way her body had been trained to read it through 1,000 hours of drilling and 2 combat deployments, and a life of being the person in the room that nobody expected to be ready. She caught it, and then she used it. The rotation came from her hips, not her arms, controlled, deliberate. The physics of it were simple, his momentum redirected. His force returned to him at an angle his leg was not designed to absorb. The sound that followed was not loud. That was the strangest part, how quiet it was relative to everything that had come before. A single crack, clean and absolute. And then Brock Reynolds was on the ground, not falling, not stumbling, down, completely and immediately down in the way that a person goes down when the body has registered something the mind hasn't processed yet, before the pain, before the understanding, just the pure biological fact of structural failure. He hit the mat, and the sound that came out of him was not the sound of a man who has been struck. It was the sound of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not believe existed. The crowd was silent. Completely, totally, extraordinary silent. 500 soldiers, not one sound, for 3 full seconds. Then the referees were in the ring moving toward both fighters simultaneously. The medical team, which had been stationed at the edge of the field in accordance with tournament protocol, was already moving before the referees reached the center. Harris had his radio up. Medical to the ring, now. Brock was on his back. His leg was at an angle that told the story without words. His face had gone a color that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the specific physiological shock of a body encountering more structural damage than it had budgeted for. He was conscious. He was looking at the sky. He was not getting up. Ava stood 3 feet away from him. She was breathing, controlled. Her hands were at her sides. She looked at Brock on the ground, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, not with anything that resembled the performance of victory. She looked at him the way you look at something that has become suddenly irreversibly real. Diana was in the ring before the medical team. She reached Ava and put one hand on her arm and didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there. "I'm okay," Ava said quietly. "I know you are." Ava stopped. "I know," Diana said, but looked at her. "I didn't mean to. I know that too." Diana's voice was steady and certain. Every camera on this field saw exactly what happened. You caught an illegal strike that was already in motion. What happened to his leg was physics, not intent. She held Ava's gaze. "You are not responsible for the choices he made." Ava nodded once. She looked at Brock again, at the medical team now working around him, at the crowd of 500 people standing in total silence, watching this moment play out. She looked at Torres, who was standing at the rope line 15 feet away, with an expression that held about 7 different emotions, and was managing none of them particularly well. She looked at the senior officers on the sideline. She looked at Sergeant Major Harris, who was looking directly at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not anger, not condemnation, not even assessment. Something more complicated, something that would take time to understand. And then she looked at the 3 observers standing 30 feet back, whom she had been aware of since yesterday afternoon without officially acknowledging their presence. And one of them, a woman in her early 50s, with the posture of someone who had been making hard decisions in difficult rooms for a very long time, was looking back at her with an expression that was entirely readable. It was the expression of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. The medical team called for a stretcher. The crowd, which had held its silence for nearly a full minute, began to find its voice again. Not in celebration, not in condemnation, but in the complicated human sound of 500 people trying simultaneously to process something that none of their previous categories were quite equipped to hold. Brock Reynolds left the ring on a stretcher, which was the first time in his military career that he had left any space other than on his own feet. Ava watched him go. Then she turned away and walked toward the edge of the field, and the crowd that had been standing between her and the exit parted ahead of her. Without anyone organizing it, without anyone giving a signal, without anything except the collective understanding that this woman needed a path and they were going to give it to her. Private Daniel, standing in the 5th row, watched her pass 6 feet in front of him. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone who had done exactly what needed to be done and was now in the process of carrying the weight of it, which is different from being defeated by it. It is, in fact, the opposite of being defeated by it. Daniels thought about his grandfather, about what service meant, about what strength looked like. He thought about all the things he had believed before yesterday morning. And then he thought about how little space those beliefs had left for what he had just watched happen. He didn't have language for it yet. He was 19 and from a small town, and some things take time to find their words. But he felt it, and that was the beginning of something. The stretcher carrying Brock Reynolds had barely cleared the competition field before the first phone was up. Not recording that had been happening since the match began. Uploading, sharing, the specific modern reflex of a person who has witnessed something significant and needs the rest of the world to witness it too immediately before the moment loses its rawness. By the time the medical team reached the base clinic, the clip was already moving. It didn't go everywhere at once. That's not how these things work. It moved the way fire moves in dry grass, finding pathways, jumping gaps, accelerating in the places where conditions were right. A soldier shared it to a private group. Someone in that group shared it publicly. A veterans forum picked it up. Then a sports account. Then a news aggregator that specialized in military stories. Then a producer at a cable news network who had a slot to fill at 5 o'clock and recognized immediately that this 47-second clip contained more genuine drama than anything she had been handed in 3 weeks. By 4 in the afternoon, it had 400,000 views. By 6, it had crossed 2 million. By the time Ava Carter sat down in Sergeant Major Harris's office for the formal post-incident review, her name was trending nationally. She didn't know that yet. Harris's office was small and deliberately plain. The office of a man who had no interest in decorating his authority because he had never needed to. He sat behind a metal desk with a legal pad in front of him and a pen that he hadn't picked up yet, and he looked at Ava the way he looked at everything directly, without performance, without the warmth that wanted something from you, or the coldness that wanted to intimidate you. Just direct. Diana Okafor sat to Ava's left. She had requested to be present during the review, and Harris had allowed it without discussion. "Walk me through the final exchange," Harris said. "Your words from the beginning." Ava did. She spoke carefully and specifically, not defensively, but with the precision of someone who has been trained to report accurately under pressure. She described Brock's approach, the feinted takedown. The moment she recognized the leg was already in motion. The decision, if it could be called a decision given that it happened faster than conscious thought, to step in rather than back. Harris listened without writing anything down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The footage is clear," he said finally. "All 7 angles. The investigation is a formality at this point. Reynolds initiated the illegal strike. You responded to a threat that was already in motion." He paused. "That's not what I need to talk to you about." Ava waited. "You're aware of the public component," Harris said. "I've been told it's circulating," Ava said. "It's beyond circulating." Harris turned his monitor so she could see it, the view count, the headline, her name. Ava looked at it for a long moment. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind her eyes shifted, the specific shift of a person recalibrating the scale of a situation they thought they had already accounted for. "How do you feel about that?" Harris asked. It was not a question she had expected from him. She took a breath. "I feel like I went into that ring to compete in a tournament, and whatever happened afterward is—" She stopped, started again. "My father used to say that you don't get to choose what your actions mean to other people. You only get to choose what they mean to you." She looked at Harris. "What it means to me is that I did my job. I stopped a threat, the way I was trained to stop a threat." Harris studied her. "And the leg?" "I regret that he got hurt," Ava said, and she meant it completely without qualification. "I don't regret stopping him." Harris nodded slowly. He picked up the pen. "Set it back down, Mum. There are going to be calls for a formal hearing," from Reynolds' side. "His legal representation is already making noise. You need to understand that even with the footage being what it is, this is going to be a process. It's going to be long, and it's going to be public, and there will be people who look at that clip and see exactly what happened, and people who look at it and see something else entirely." "I understand," Ava said. "Do you have support outside this base? Family, legal?" "I have Diana," Ava said simply. Harris glanced at Diana, who said nothing but held his gaze with the specific composure of someone who has already made their commitments and doesn't need to restate them. Harris nodded. You're dismissed for tonight. Report to me at 0800. Ava stood. Diana stood with her. At the door, Ava turned back. Sergeant Major. Harris looked up. Torres reported his concerns to you this morning, before the match. Harris's expression didn't change. I want that on record, Ava said. He did the right thing. Harris held her gaze for a moment. Then he made a note on the legal pad. Noted. Outside in the corridor, Diana put her hand briefly on Ava's shoulder. You okay? Ask me in a week, Ava said. They walked out together into an evening that had already become something neither of them had fully anticipated when they woke up that morning. The reaction inside the base divided along lines that surprised some people and confirmed what others had suspected for years. The soldiers who had cheered loudest for Brock Reynolds the previous morning were the quietest now. Not all of them had changed their minds, but the specific confidence of people who believed the world agreed with them had taken a crack. When you watch something happen in front of 500 witnesses and 7 cameras, and there is no version of the footage that supports your preferred interpretation, the cognitive work of maintaining a contrary position gets expensive. Some paid it anyway. Corporal Marsh sat in the barracks that night and stared at his phone. The clip was everywhere. He had watched it 11 times. Each time the 47 seconds played out exactly the same way. Brock's leg going back, the referees screaming, the catch, the rotation, the crack. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about the morning, about what he had told Torres, about the phrase she's not leaving that ring on her own feet, and how he had reported it as a minor thing, a context thing, the kind of locker room talk you file away and don't act on, because acting on it requires a kind of courage that has a cost. He thought about that cost. He thought about what it had actually cost instead. Torres 2 bunks over wasn't sleeping either. But Torres had a different quality of wakefulness. Not guilt exactly, but the specific state of a person who did the right thing and is still not sure it was enough or fast enough or said clearly enough to matter. He had reported what he knew to Harris. He had done it. And Harris had acted on it, the additional referees at the ring, the protocol warning. Whether that had been enough to prevent what happened was a question Torres was going to carry for a long time. Marsh, Torres said quietly into the dark. A pause. Yeah. You heard what he said this morning. Another pause. Longer. Yeah. Why didn't you report it? The question sat in the dark for a while. Then Marsh said, because I've been around him for 2 years and I know what it costs to be the guy who reports Brock Reynolds. A beat. Or I thought I knew. And now Marsh was quiet. Now I know what it costs not to. It was the most honest thing Torres had ever heard Marsh say. And he didn't have a response for it because the truth was that they were both somewhere on the same spectrum. Different points, different choices, but the same fundamental question about what it meant to serve in a way you could actually be proud of. The base went to sleep around them restless and divided and in the middle of something that wasn't finished. 48 hours after the clip first appeared online, the view count had crossed 12 million. The commentary had long since escaped in any single narrative. News networks were running panel discussions. Veterans groups were posting responses. Advocacy organizations on 3 sides of the gender in military debate were citing the clip as evidence for their respective positions. A congresswoman from California had issued a statement. A senator from Texas had issued a counter-statement. 2 sports channels had featured retired fighters analyzing the technique from a purely athletic standpoint. The purely athletic analysts were almost unanimously impressed. One of them, a retired UFC heavyweight who had spent 15 years studying joint manipulation, described what Ava had done in the final exchange as textbook physics executed under extreme pressure in a fraction of a second. He said on air that most trained fighters given the same situation would have moved backward rather than forward, and that the decision to step in and catch rather than retreat was either extraordinarily trained or extraordinarily instinctive, and that in his professional opinion it was both. That segment got 2 million views on its own. But the piece of the story that spread furthest and fastest was not the analysis. It was not the political commentary. It was not even the clip of the catch in the crack. It was the 12 seconds immediately after. The 12 seconds where Ava Carter stood 3 feet from Brock Reynolds on the ground and looked at him. Not with triumph, not with contempt, was something that once you saw it, you could not unsee, a kind of serious, unperformed human acknowledgement that what had just happened was real and had weight and was not something to celebrate. That 12 seconds cut through everything else. Because people who had already decided how they felt about the clip, for or against, hero or aggressor, justified or excessive, watched those 12 seconds and felt something complicate inside them. Something that didn't fit neatly into the position they had already taken. A 71-year-old retired Army veteran named Gerald Watkins, living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, watched the clip 4 times. He had served in Vietnam. He had opinions about women in combat roles that had been in place for 50 years and had not been seriously challenged in all that time. He watched those 12 seconds. Then he called his daughter, who had been trying to have this conversation with him for 3 years. She answered on the second ring. "I watched that clip," he said. "The one with the Navy SEAL." "I know, Dad. I sent it to you." "I know you did." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I owe you an apology for some things I said a while back." His daughter was quiet on the other end. Then she said, "Okay, Dad. Okay," he said. That conversation happened in thousands of versions across the country that week. Not all of them, not most of them, but thousands. On the base, Ava was formally cleared of any wrongdoing 72 hours after the incident. The investigation reviewed all 7 angles of footage, the testimony of 4 referees, the report Torres had filed with the Harris, and the medical assessment of Brock's injury. The conclusion was 18 pages long, and its central finding occupied 3 sentences. Petty Officer Ava Carter acted in response to an illegal strike that was already in motion at the time of contact. Her response was proportional to the threat presented. No punitive action is warranted. Brock Reynolds received a formal reprimand, a suspension of his training instructor duties pending review, and a referral to the military's Conduct Assessment Board. His legal representation released a statement that evening suggesting the investigation had been compromised by the public attention surrounding the case. Harris read the statement and set it aside without responding. Ava read it standing in Diana's office and set it aside in the same way. Diana watched her. "You're not going to say anything publicly?" "No," Ava said. "Even with everything there." Ava looked at her. "I didn't break his leg to make a point. I broke his leg because he gave me no other option. If I start making statements about it, I'm making it into something it wasn't." She paused. It was a defensive response. That's all it was. The rest of it, the video, the news, the politics, that's not mine. I'm not going to claim it. Diana looked at her for a long moment. "Your father taught you that too." Ava was quiet for a moment. "My father taught me that the most powerful thing you can say is nothing if what you'd say otherwise is designed for the audience and not for the truth." Diana absorbed that. Then she said very quietly, "He sounds like he was something." "He was everything," Ava said. It was the first time she had said that out loud to anyone since his death. She felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of something you've been carrying so long. You've stopped noticing it until you set it down for just a second and feel the difference. Diana didn't try to fill the silence that followed. She just let it be. 6 days after the match, Leo Torres received an unexpected visitor in the form of Sergeant Major Harris himself, who appeared at the door of the communications training room where Torres was running a routing exercise and said simply, "Walk with me." They walked. Harris didn't speak for the first 2 minutes. They crossed the administrative quad, past the equipment building, moved along the edge of the main training field where the competition ring had stood 6 days ago and now was gone. The ground returned to ordinary ground. Then Harris said, "Your report." Torres waited. "It was noted in the formal investigation file," Harris said, "as an action consistent with military values and chain of command responsibility." He paused. "It will be part of your service record." Torres felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a precise name for. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." Harris stopped walking, looked at him. "Don't thank me. That's not why I'm telling you." He held Torres's gaze with the specific directness that was his signature. "I'm telling you because the next time you see something that needs reporting, I want you to remember that it went on record, that it counted, that it was the right thing and it was noted." A pause. "Because the next time might be harder, and I want you to know it's still worth doing." Torres nodded. "Yes, Sergeant Major." Harris nodded once and walked back toward the administrative building. Torres stood on the edge of the training field for a long moment, looking at the ground where the ring had been. He thought about Ava Carter, about Brock Reynolds on the stretcher, about Marsh in the dark saying, "Now I know what it costs not to." He thought about his own father, who had served 20 years and come home and told Torres once in the kitchen of their house in New Mexico that the bravest thing he ever did in the military had nothing to do with combat, that it was a conversation he had with a commanding officer about something wrong he had seen when every instinct he had told him to keep his mouth shut and protect his career. Torres had been 16 when his father told him that. He hadn't fully understood it then. He understood it now. Meanwhile, the story that Ava had tried to give back to the world, the story she had refused to claim, refused to perform, refused to make into a statement or a symbol kept moving anyway. Because that's what true things do. You can refuse to amplify them. You can stay quiet and keep your head down and say it was just a defensive response, just physics, just a thing that happened in a ring. And all of that can be true, and the thing still moves because it doesn't need your help. It has its own momentum. It moves through the conversations people have when they think no one important is listening. It moves through the phone calls between fathers and daughters, and the quiet arguments in barracks, and the moments when someone who has held a position for 50 years watches 12 seconds of footage and feels something shift. It moves through Private Daniels, who went home on leave 3 weeks later and sat across from his mother at the kitchen table and said unprompted, "Mom, I saw something at the base. I want to tell you about it," and told her the whole story from beginning to end while she listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When he finished, his mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you think it means?" Daniels thought about that for a long time. "I think," he said slowly, "it means I've been wrong about some things, and that being wrong about them is okay as long as I actually change them." He paused. "I don't know exactly how to do that yet, but I think knowing I need to is the start." His mother looked at her son, 19 years old, 3 months into his first posting, already carrying something heavier and more real than she had expected the military to give him this quickly. She felt proud in a way that was complicated by something that felt like grief, and she understood that those two feelings were not in opposition. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "That's the start," she agreed. And somewhere in a rehabilitation clinic in San Antonio, Brock Reynolds lay in a hospital bed with his leg in an external fixator and a television mounted on the wall playing a news program where two commentators were arguing about the clip that had 12 million views. He watched it without sound. He watched the 12 seconds where Ava stood 3 feet from him after he went down. He watched her expression, the one he hadn't seen from his position on the mat, the one he was only now encountering through a camera angle he hadn't known existed. He watched it 6 times. Then he turned off the television and stared at the ceiling. His career was suspended. His reputation was in the process of being comprehensively revised by people who had never met him and people who had known him for years with equal and opposite force. His leg was going to require months of rehabilitation and might never return to full function. He had done this. Not Ava Carter, not the referees, not the Pentagon observers or the cameras, or the 12 million people who had watched him go down. He had done this. Brock Reynolds was not at his core a man without intelligence. He was a man whose intelligence had been in service of his ego for so long that the two had become indistinguishable. He had never had to confront the difference because the world had never made him. Now the world had made him. He lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling and felt something he had not felt since he was a child small. Not in the physical sense, in the specific interior sense of a person who has been shown at significant personal cost exactly how large the gap is between who they believed they were and who they actually turned out to be. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was for the first time in a very long time, an honest one. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No announcement, no ceremony, just a sealed envelope on Diana Okafor's desk with a classification header that Diana recognized immediately because she had spent 22 years in the military and she knew what that particular header meant and which office it came from and what it was almost never used for unless something serious was being offered to someone serious. She picked it up, looked at the name on the front, Petty Officer Ava Carter. She set it back down, picked up her phone, called Ava. "You need to come to my office," Diana said. "Is something wrong?" "No," a pause. "Just come." Just Ava arrived 7 minutes later, still in her training clothes, a water bottle in her hand. She had spent the morning running drills on the far field, not for anyone, not to prove anything, just because that was what she did. Movement was how she processed. It always had been. Even in the weeks since the match, when the base had been strange and loud and full of eyes that followed her in ways she was still adjusting to, the training field was the one place that felt unchanged. She walked into Diana's office and saw the envelope on the desk. She stopped. Diana watched her face. Watched the recognition move through it, not shock, but the particular stillness of someone who has allowed themselves to hope for something quietly, privately, without saying it out loud, and is now standing in the moment where that hope either becomes real or doesn't. "Sit down," Diana said. "I'd rather stand." Diana pushed the envelope across the desk toward her. Ava picked it up. Her hands were steady, the same hands that had caught Brock Reynolds' leg mid-swing 3 weeks ago. She broke the seal carefully, unfolded the single page inside, and read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and put both hands flat on the surface next to it and breathed. "Well," Diana said. Ava looked up, and for the first time since Diana had known her, through the tournament, through the investigation, through the 12 million view media storm, through every formal review and informal conversation and sleepless night, Ava Carter's composure did something it had not done once in all of that. It cracked, just at the edges, just enough. Her eyes filled and she didn't blink it away. "They're offering me the program," she said. Diana nodded. She already knew. She had known from the header on the envelope. But knowing it and hearing Ava say it were two different things, and the second one hit her in the chest in a way she hadn't fully prepared for. "The Advanced Warfare Unit," Ava said. "The one that's been closed." She stopped, looked at the letter again. "Colonel Rice signed it personally." "I know." "They're citing the incident as a demonstration of," Ava read from the letter. Her voice steady again, now pulled back to controlled by the discipline that lived in her so deeply it was practically structural. "Controlled force application under duress, defensive protocol, execution, and command of psychological pressure under public observation." She set the letter down. "They're using what happened as a qualification." "Because it was one," Diana said simply. Ava was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the wall behind Diana's desk, not at anything specific, just at the middle distance where you look when you're seeing something internal. "He said I was an embarrassment," she said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "3 weeks ago, in front of the whole base. I remember. And now the Pentagon is using my response to his attack as evidence that I belong in a program that's never admitted a woman." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know how to hold both of those things at the same time." Diana leaned forward. "You don't have to hold them at the same time. You just have to decide what you do next." Ava looked at her. "I already know what I do next." "Yeah," Diana said. "I know you do." The acceptance process took 3 weeks. It was not quiet or simple. Nothing connected to Ava Carter's name was quiet or simple anymore, and the announcement that she had been accepted into the Advanced Warfare Program generated a second wave of media attention that, if anything, was louder than the first. This time, the news wasn't 47 seconds of footage. It was a story with chapters: the tournament, the match, the investigation, the clearance, and now this. A narrative that had been moving in one direction since Brock Reynolds had laughed at a bracket sheet 3 weeks ago, and a woman in a gray training shirt had heard every word. Ava gave one interview. One. She agreed to it on the condition that she controlled the format, and the condition was accepted because, at this point, her name moved things in a way that made news organizations agreeable. The interviewer was a veteran journalist named Marcus Webb, who had covered military affairs for 20 years and who had, to his credit, read everything available before sitting down across from her. He led with the question everyone wanted answered: "Do you see yourself as a symbol?" Ava was quiet for a moment, and then, "No. I see myself as a Navy SEAL who competed in a tournament and defended herself when the rules stopped being followed." She looked at him steadily. "If that becomes a symbol to someone, that's their experience, not mine. I can't control what my actions mean to other people. I can only control what they mean to me." "And what do they mean to you?" Another pause. Longer this time. "My father was a decorated combat veteran. He served for 26 years. He taught me to fight when I was 10 years old, and the first thing he ever said to me about fighting was that the goal is never to hurt someone. The goal is to stop being hurt." She stopped. He died 2 years ago. Training accident. Nothing dramatic. Her voice stayed level, but something moved underneath it, controlled, contained, present. Every time I step into a ring, or onto a field, or into any situation where the stakes are real, I hear his voice. Not telling me what to do, just there. The way people who have really loved you are always there. She looked at Marcus Webb. What happened in that ring was my father's training, my SEAL training, and the decision of one man who chose to break the rules. That's the whole story. Everything else people are making of it, that's theirs to carry, not mine. Marcus Webb had been doing this for 20 years. He did not get emotional on camera. He came close that day. The interview ran in full. No edits, no commentary added around it. The network made the decision to let it stand alone because someone in the editing room understood instinctively that adding anything to it would make it smaller. It got 6 million views in 48 hours. And in a rehabilitation clinic in San Antonio, Brock Reynolds watched it. He had been watching a lot of things in the 6 weeks since the match. He had time more of it than he had ever had in his adult life, because when you are lying in a clinic bed with a leg and hardware, and a career under formal review time is the one thing the world gives you in unlimited supply. He watched the interview 3 times. The third time, he was not watching Ava. He was listening. There is a difference. Watching is surface. Listening is what happens when you stop preparing your response and start actually receiving what someone is giving you. He listened to her talk about her father. He thought about his own. Brock Reynolds had not spoken to his father in 8 years. The reasons were complicated in the way that family reasons always are layered old, full of things that had been said and things that had never been said, in a specific silence that had calcified over time into something that felt permanent. His father was a man who had never been satisfied, who had measured Brock against standards that moved every time Brock reached them, who had communicated approval exclusively through its absence. Brock had spent his entire military career building something large enough that his father would have to see it. He had never stopped to ask whether what he was building was actually good. He turned off the television. Then he asked the nurse for a pen and a piece of paper, not a phone, not a tablet, but actual paper, and he sat in the bed with the paper on the hard surface of a medical tray, and he started writing. It took him 4 attempts in 3 hours. When he was done, he had a letter that was 7 paragraphs long and addressed to Petty Officer Ava Carter, U.S. Navy SEAL. He stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in an envelope and asked the nurse to mail it. He did not know if she would read it. He did not know if she should read it. He only knew that writing it had done something to the interior architecture of a man who had spent 15 years building walls and calling them strength. The letter arrived at Fort Hardin 10 days later. Diana brought it to Ava without comment because it had Brock Reynolds' name in the return address, and Diana understood that this was not a moment that required her opinion. She set it on Ava's desk and left. Ava looked at the envelope for a long time. She thought about not opening it. She gave that option genuine consideration, not out of fear, but out of the specific self-protective instinct of someone who has already processed something hard and is not sure they want to open a door to processing it again. Then she thought about what her father would have said. He would have said, you don't have to forgive someone because they apologize, but you should always know what they said before you decide. She opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten. The handwriting was not what she expected. Careful, almost deliberate, the writing of someone who had slowed down significantly from whatever pace they normally moved at. She read it. Then she read it again. Brock Reynolds did not make excuses in the letter. That was the first thing she noticed, and the most important one. He did not describe the circumstances that had led to his behavior. He did not explain his upbringing or his pressures or the ways the military culture had shaped him. He did not ask her to understand him. He said simply that he had been wrong, that his behavior in the days leading up to the match and in the ring itself had been indefensible, that she had stopped him the only way available to her, and that he did not hold her responsible for the outcome, that her composure and her skill had revealed something about him that he had been avoiding his entire career. He said that he was sorry, not sorry he had gotten hurt, sorry for what he had done. And in the last paragraph, he said something that Ava read 4 times before she set the letter down. He wrote, I don't know if this letter does anything useful for you. I'm writing it because I needed to say it and because I think at some level I've spent 15 years being afraid of people like you. People who are genuinely good at something, who don't need the crowd's approval to know their own worth. I turned that fear into contempt, and I aimed it at you, and I was wrong. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I know that. Ava sat with the letter for a long time. Then she put it in the small metal box where she kept the things that mattered. Her father's service photograph, a folded letter from her SEAL training completion, 2 challenge coins, and a handwritten recipe card in her mother's handwriting for the green chili stew she had grown up eating every Sunday. She put Brock Reynolds' letter in that box, and she closed the lid. She didn't respond to it. Not then, not for a long time. But the act of putting it in the box was its own kind of answer. The answer of someone who has received something genuine and chosen to treat it as such without drama, without performance, in the quiet way that real things get handled. 8 months after the tournament at Fort Hardin, the military released new comprehensive guidelines for gender-inclusive combat training protocols. The document was 43 pages long and cited 17 case studies. The Fort Hardin incident, referred to in the document by its official case number rather than by name, was cited in 4 separate sections each time as an example of something different: controlled force application, psychological composure under observation, defensive protocol execution, and the systemic need for robust pre-incident reporting structures. Torres read the document the day it was released. He found his own case number, the formal report he had filed with Harris before the match, referenced in the section on reporting structures. He read the paragraph twice. Then he called his father in New Mexico. "Hey, Dad," he said when the line connected. "Leo, everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's good." He paused. "I just wanted to tell you something about that conversation you had with your CO, the one you told me about when I was 16. His father was quiet for a moment. "That was a long time ago." "I know, but I did something like that recently, and I wanted you to know it went on record. That it counted." Torres paused again. "And I wanted to tell you that what you said back then, I understand it now. I didn't then, but I do now." On the other end of the line, in a kitchen in New Mexico, his father sat down at the table. "Tell me what happened," his father said. And Torres told him. The military leadership conference happened 11 months after the tournament. It was held at a training facility in Virginia, attended by 600 officers and instructors from across all branches, and its stated focus was on evolving leadership culture in professional military environments. Ava Carter attended as a speaker. She was now one of 6 women in the Advanced Warfare Program, the first cohort of its kind in the program's history. She spoke for 22 minutes on controlled force application and psychological composure in high-stakes environments. Her remarks were precise, impractical, and entirely free of anything self-congratulatory. She spoke about her father's training. She spoke about the difference between fighting with anger and fighting with control. She spoke about what it means to be genuinely prepared versus what it means to simply be loud. The room of 600 people listened the way people listen when someone is saying something real. When she finished, the applause was immediate and genuine. And then something happened that was not on the program schedule. Something that the conference organizers had not been informed of in advance, because the person who requested it had done so through a private channel and had specifically asked that it not be announced ahead of time. A man walked from the back of the room toward the front. He walked with a permanent limp, a slight unmistakable irregularity in his gait that would be part of him for the rest of his life. He wore his uniform. His posture was straight. His face was the face of a man who has done significant interior reconstruction over the past 11 months and is still living in the middle of that work. Brock Reynolds walked to the front of the room and stopped 6 feet from Ava Carter. The room went completely still. 500 people who had been applauding 30 seconds ago were now holding their breath because every person in that room knew this story. They knew these 2 names. They had watched the clip. They had read the investigation. They had followed everything that had followed everything, and none of them had expected this. Ava looked at him. He looked at her. For 3 seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence had weight and texture and a specific quality that the room could feel, not hostility, not performance, but 2 people in the same space carrying the full complexity of a shared history that neither of them had chosen and both of them had survived. Then Brock said into the microphone that Ava was still holding because she hadn't yet handed it off, "Can I say something?" Ava looked at him for a moment. Then she held out the microphone. He took it. He turned to face the room. He didn't have notes. He hadn't prepared remarks. He had prepared himself, which is a different and harder thing. "My name is Sergeant Brock Reynolds," he said. His voice was steady. "Most of you know who I am. Most of you know why." He paused. "I'm not here to explain myself. I'm here because I asked the conference organizers if I could have 5 minutes, and because I think there are things that need to be said in a room like this in front of people like you, rather than in a press statement or a legal document." He looked at the room. "I was wrong," he said, "not just in the ring, before the ring, in everything that led to it, in the way I treated a fellow service member, in the way I treated dozens of service members over years, if I'm being honest, which I am trying to be." He stopped. "I spent 15 years believing that strength was something you demonstrated by making other people smaller. And I was wrong about that in a way that cost me my career, my health, and a long time in a clinic bed thinking about who I actually am when nobody's watching." A pause. "Turns out I didn't know. Turns out I had confused performing strength with having it." The room was absolutely silent. "Petty Officer Carter." He turned to look at her directly, the same way she had looked at him across a competition ring 11 months ago, without performance, without deflection, with the specific courage of full eye contact between people who have been through something real together. "What you did in that ring was not just technically correct. It was morally correct. You stopped a threat with the minimum force available to you. You didn't humiliate me when you had every opportunity to. You didn't make a statement. You just did what needed to be done, and then you walked away." He paused. "I've thought about those 12 seconds more than I've thought about anything in my life. The way you looked at me after. Not like you'd won. Like you understood something about what had just happened that I didn't understand yet." He handed the microphone back to her. And then in front of 600 officers and instructors and the cameras that were recording the session, Sergeant Brock Reynolds extended his hand. The room held its breath. Ava looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She read what was there, the way she had always read people, not with suspicion, not with charity, but with the specific, accurate attention of someone who has been trained to see what is actually present rather than what they expect to find. What she found was genuine. She took his hand. The room exhaled. The applause that followed was not the applause of a crowd that has been entertained. It was something older and more human than that, the sound of people who have witnessed something they did not expect to witness, something that rearranged even slightly their understanding of what change looks like and how long it takes and what it costs. Private Daniels, now Specialist Daniels, promoted 4 months prior, was in the room. He was there as part of a junior leadership observation program, sitting in the back row with 11 other junior enlisted soldiers. When Ava took Brock's hand, Daniels felt something shift in his chest that he recognized now, 11 months later, as the same thing he had felt standing in the 5th row at Fort Hardin. He recognized it now because he had felt it enough times in the past year to have a name for it. It was the feeling of a belief updating, of a framework expanding to hold something it hadn't been built to hold, of a person becoming in small increments a little more honest about the world and their place in it. It was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable, not once in 11 months, but it was the most important thing he had felt in his life. After the conference in the hallway outside the main session room, Ava stood with Diana, who had flown in for the day, citing scheduling flexibility that everyone understood was not flexibility at all, but deliberate prioritization. And the two of them were quiet for a moment in the specific way of people who have been through something together and don't need to annotate it. "How do you feel?" Diana asked. Ava thought about it honestly. "Like something finished," she said. "Not ended. Finished. There's a difference." Diana nodded slowly. "Your father." It wasn't a question, but Ava answered it anyway. "He would have hated the media circus," she said. "He would have been embarrassed by the attention." A small, real smile moved across her face, not performed, not offered for anyone else's benefit. Just a moment of private truth made briefly visible. But he would have understood the handshake. He would have said that was the whole point. She paused. He always said the measure of a fighter isn't what they do when they win. It's what they do with the silence after. She looked down the hallway at the 600 people moving through it, at the life that was continuing in all directions around this moment. "I think I finally understand what he meant," she said. She stood straight, breathed, And then Ava Carter, Navy SEAL, 25 years old, daughter of a decorated veteran who had taught her that strength without discipline is just noise, walked forward into the rest of her life. Not as a symbol, not as a story, not as a clip with 12 million views or a case number in a 43-page policy document. As herself, which was in the end the only thing she had ever been trying to be. And it turned out that was more than enough.